They did not aim for our cities. They did not aim for our reactors, our shipyards, our fleets sitting at anchor in low orbit. The Kholrath Dominion aimed for approximately 4,000 people, and only 4,000 people in the first 90 seconds of the war. Every one of them wore rank insignia above the grade of captain. The Dominion called it Operation Severance. They called it Mercy. The strike came from 6 vessels that never entered atmosphere. Kinetic darts, needle-thin, guided by optical recognition keyed to insignia patterns harvested from a decade of satellite imagery. No building fell. No power grid failed. 4,312 officers, across every branch and every theater, died within the same minute, and the Dominion considered this a demonstration of extraordinary self-control. The formal communication arrived 11 minutes later, routed through every open frequency humanity had. It read, in part, "The undersigned regrets that decision-capable personnel of Terran military structures required removal from operational status prior to further discourse. This removal is offered as an alternative to protracted conflict and total structural destruction, and should be understood as an act of restraint. The Dominion trusts this gesture will be received in the spirit intended." Command bunkers across 6 continents went silent at the same moment, for the same reason. Then, in a converted lecture hall outside Leavenworth, Kansas, a woman who held no combat command at all picked up a phone that was still ringing from a dead man's office and answered it. The physical evidence came in slower than the grief did. Salvage teams pulled 3 darts from concrete and drywall in Brussels, Seoul, and Fort Meade, and each one carried the same glyph stamped into its casing. A small, tidy mark that Dominion linguists would later confirm meant, roughly, administrative correction. Not weapon, not warhead, correction. The word did more damage to morale in the first hour than the strike itself because it meant the Dominion did not consider what it had done to be violence. It considered it paperwork. 6 hours after the strike, Overseer Vantrelshow addressed the survivors directly. In English so precise it had no accent at all, because the Dominion had been listening to humanity's broadcasts for a very long time and had practiced. He smiled in the particular way of a species that had learned human facial expressions from television and applied them slightly too evenly. "We have spared your infrastructure," he said. "Your factories, your homes, your hospitals untouched. In several centuries you may come to understand the courtesy we have shown you tonight." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Behind him, unseen by the cameras, an entire fleet held position at the edge of the system, waiting for a collapse that Vantrelshow considered a formality. For the better part of a day, that collapse looked inevitable. Radio traffic from forward units carried the particular static of soldiers waiting for orders that would never come, calling ranks that no longer answered. And then, unit by unit, without instruction from anyone above them, the traffic changed shape. Major Renata Osai had spent 11 years being told her work was a waste of training budget. She ran doctrine development at the Army's Leadership Development Command, and her specific, unglamorous obsession was command redundancy. The idea that every soldier, not just the ones with bars and stars, should be drilled to assume command of the unit above them with no discontinuity in judgment or authority. Her critics, and there had been many, called it preparing privates to be generals, meant as an insult, filed formally in 2 separate budget reviews as a reason to cut her program. She had kept teaching it anyway in bases across 4 continents to soldiers who mostly assumed they'd never need it. She was in the lecture hall when the strike hit, halfway through a slide on succession triggers, and she did not go quiet with the rest of the room. She looked at the phone that had started ringing on a colonel's desk 3 doors down, a colonel who, she would learn within the hour, was already dead. And she picked it up herself, because someone had to, and said the sentence that would end up quoted in 3 separate after-action reports before the week was over. "They didn't cut off the head," she said. "They just told every private in uniform that it was their turn." The first real evidence that Osai was right, rather than merely defiant, came from Sergeant Tomas Reyes, a signals analyst at Fort Meade who had spent the previous 4 years being politely ignored for arguing that the Dominion's transmissions showed a structure worth mapping, not just decrypting. He had been told more than once that traffic analysis was a support function, not a strategic one. He stopped walking through the operations floor entirely when the pattern first resolved on his screen, because his legs did not seem interested in cooperating with the rest of him. He sat down on the floor in front of the console because it was easier than falling over standing up. What he had found was this: every Dominion strike craft, every ground unit, every orbital platform, issued and received its tactical orders through exactly one relay, a vessel loitering at the edge of the debris field that the Dominion's own traffic referred to only as the cradle. Nothing moved without routing through it first. Not because the cradle carried unique weapons or unique armor, but because Dominion doctrine did not permit local units to originate their own orders. Every subordinate craft was a terminal. The cradle was the only node in the entire structure allowed to think. It's not resilience, Reyes said, once his voice came back to something steady. It's the opposite of resilience. It's one point holding up everything above it. The second discovery belonged to Dr. Priya Nair, a cryptolinguist who had spent a career being told that grammar was not a weapon and that the Pentagon did not fund hobbies. She had pushed for 3 years to study the internal caste markers embedded in Dominion communications, small honorifics, buried in verb conjugation, that indicated exactly who was permitted to issue a given instruction and who was only permitted to receive one. Nobody had wanted to pay for it. She got her answer for free 40 minutes after Reyes did, listening to intercepted chatter from a Dominion ground unit that had lost contact with the cradle during atmospheric interference. The unit did nothing. Not retreated, not advanced, not improvised. It held position and repeated its last received instruction, word, for 6 minutes, waiting for a correction that did not come, because nothing in 3,000 years of Dominion military culture had ever asked a soldier to decide anything for himself. They don't have officers who can improvise, Nair said quietly to a room that had gone very still around her. They have officers who are allowed to speak and everyone else who is allowed to listen. The third discovery took longer, because it required patience rather than decryption, and it belonged to Lieutenant Yusuf Bello, a field historian attached to Joint Staff whose entire job before the war had consisted of writing reports nobody above the rank of major bothered to read. Bello had spent 18 months documenting exactly how fast surviving human units reformed a functioning chain of command after losing an officer in exercises, and he had been mocked for it in 3 separate budget hearings as an academic curiosity with no combat application. He now had real data, and the real data was worse for the Dominion than any simulation had predicted. Of the units that lost their commanding officer in the first 90 seconds of the war, 91% had a soldier issuing coherent tactical orders within 4 minutes. 19 of those soldiers were privates. Bello read the number twice before he trusted it, and then he did not say anything for almost a full minute, because there was nothing to add to it that wouldn't diminish it. The fourth discovery came from Master Sergeant June Okafor, who had spent a decade in signals intelligence being told her interest in enemy command culture, as opposed to enemy hardware, was a distraction from the metrics that actually mattered. She was the one who put the first 3 discoveries into a single sentence, sitting at a console at 2 in the morning with a coffee she had forgotten to drink. They built a weapon, she said, out of the assumption that cutting the head off a body kills it. And they built their own army the exact same way. Her hand did not move for a moment after she said it, hovering over the keyboard, because the implication was larger than the sentence carrying it. If the cradle went dark, the Dominion's entire local force would freeze the same way that isolated ground unit had frozen. Not damaged, paralyzed, waiting for permission that no longer existed anywhere to give. Osei listened to all 4 reports in under 6 hours, standing in a room that had 12 hours earlier been full of people who outranked her. They studied our org chart, she said. Nobody ever told them to read the training manual instead. It was the closest she came, in the entire war, to sounding satisfied with anything. The Dominion noticed the anomaly roughly the same time humanity understood what to do with it, which was the worst possible timing for Vantral Show personally. Reports of unauthorized continuity of command among Terran forces reached the Dominion's oversight body, an institution translated with some effort as the Assembly of Correction within 18 hours of the strike. And the Assembly's response arrived not as a battle order but as a formal notice of review, which frightened Vantral Show considerably more than any human weapon could have. His answer was to order the erasure of the anomaly before anyone above him could study it. A full bombardment fleet, already staged at the edge of the system for exactly this contingency, received orders to commence total suppression of the affected sector in 36 hours, with explicit instruction that Terran command structures, official and improvised alike, be the priority target. The message that reached Earth's remaining command network was, characteristically, dressed as courtesy. The Dominion regrets that the previous demonstration of restraint has been misinterpreted as an invitation to disorder. A corrective action of appropriate scale will commence at the conclusion of the current cycle. Terran forces are advised there will be no further notice. Osei read it twice in a room with Reyes, Nair, Bello, and Okafor and did not flinch. 36 hours, she said, then we stopped being patient about the cradle. The strike on the cradle began the instant the Dominion's ultimatum expired, and it did not resemble anything the war planners had originally drawn up. 4 modified interceptor squadrons, 16 craft total, approached the relay vessel on staggered vectors, using jamming profiles built directly from Okafor's decryption work to blind its short-range sensor net for exactly 40 seconds. Reyes had mapped the cradle's defensive envelope down to the second. Point defense cycle time of 2.8 seconds, 3 blind arcs created by its own communication mass geometry, and a single reinforced coupling connecting its command core to its transmission array. 2 interceptors were lost in the first 11 seconds. Torn apart by point defense fire, the cradle's automated systems fired with mechanical precision. Because point defense did not require initiative, and the Dominion's automated systems were very good at things that did not require initiative. The remaining 14 split formation. 10 drew fire along the cradle's flank. 4 ran the blind arc directly at the coupling. For 6 seconds the cradle adapted. Its secondary battery rotated faster than Reyes' model had predicted, and it clipped one of the 4 attacking craft across its port wing, spinning it out of formation. It was the one moment the Dominion got something right, and it cost them the exact 6 seconds Reyes had allowed for error. The remaining 3 interceptors put 14 rounds into the coupling. The cradle's transmission array went dark at 18 minutes and 4 seconds into the engagement. What happened next did not look like a battle at all. Dominion ground units across 3 continents stopped mid-maneuver, holding position, awaiting instructions that no longer existed anywhere to give. One orbital strike craft, already committed to an attack run on Sol, broke off entirely and drifted, engines idling, for 4 full minutes before a human interceptor pilot got close enough to see there was no one firing back. A single Dominion ground company cut off near the Belgian coast, raised a white signal flare within the hour, the first surrender of the war, and the human company commander, a 23-year-old corporal 3 days into her first command, let them withdraw under escort rather than press the advantage, because Osai's doctrine had one line in it about mercy that Reyes liked to quote afterward. An enemy who cannot function without permission is not a threat you need to destroy, only a threat you need to outlast. Total engagement time, 19 minutes 40 seconds. The tactical situation was resolved within the hour. Osai was already back at a terminal within 20 minutes, drafting a memo nobody had asked her to write, because the strategic situation had not been resolved at all, and she intended to be the one who resolved it. Vantral Show's second transmission arrived 4 hours later, and it was not routed through the Assembly's formal channels. It came alone, unencrypted, addressed to no official recipient. There was a pause before he spoke, a genuine one, longer than any hesitation his species usually allowed itself on camera, and when he did speak, his voice had none of the polish from the first broadcast. "We assumed," he said, "that authority in your species worked the way it works in mine. That removing it would remove your capacity to act. This was audacious of us, and it was wrong, and I do not believe the Assembly will let me explain the difference to them before they explain it to me." He did not smile this time. "I underestimated what you had trained your soldiers to be. I will not have the opportunity to make that mistake twice." The transmission ended there, no demand, no further threat. Just an admission delivered privately from one professional to another. Osai read the transcript once, then set it aside, because there was a second document already open on her screen. A formal proposal drafted before the battle had even finished to expand the redundant command curriculum from a single service pilot program into a mandatory standard across every branch of the Terran coalition, allied forces included. The budget reviewers who had spent 3 years calling her work a waste had not survived long enough to object, and the ones who remained no longer had grounds to. "They'll want a statement," Reyes said from the doorway. "Something for the press, something about the battle." Osai did not look up from the training curriculum in front of her. "Tell them the battle's already over," she said. "I've been thinking about the next war since about hour 6. She was still revising the second module when the lights in the room flickered back to full power, and she did not stop to notice.